Have you ever felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of stuff around you? Maybe it's the clutter on your desk, the endless notifications on your phone, or the constant pressure to keep up with a lifestyle that never seems to pause. Despite all this more, many of us wake up feeling strangely empty, restless even. It's like we are drowning in abundance, yet starved for meaning. This feeling isn't just a modern-day nuisance. It's a quiet crisis that touches millions worldwide, a subtle but persistent hunger for simplicity, peace, and genuine connection. In a world designed to pull us in every direction, the call for minimalism grows louder. But minimalism isn't just about getting rid of things. It's a deeper invitation to step back and ask, what truly matters? Ancient wisdom offers us timeless answers. Buddhism, in particular, holds a profound lens through which we can view this pursuit of simplicity. Long before decluttering became a trendy buzzword, Buddhist teachings illuminated the path of letting go, not only of material possessions, but also of the mental and emotional attachments that bind us. Minimalism, when seen through the eyes of Buddhist wisdom, transforms from a mere lifestyle choice into a spiritual practice. It becomes a way to untangle the knots of desire, distraction, and dissatisfaction that so often keep us trapped. This is not about deprivation or sacrifice. It is about discovering freedom, the freedom to live with intention, to be fully present, and to connect deeply with life itself. Imagine living in a way that invites peace, clarity, and purpose into every moment. What if simplicity could be the doorway to a richer, fuller experience, rather than a lack? What if the things you own no longer owned you, but instead served as gentle reminders of what truly nourishes your heart and soul? In this exploration, we will journey beyond the surface of minimalism, beyond just reducing clutter or following a trend. We'll delve into the heart of Buddhist teachings, uncovering how the principles of detachment, mindfulness, and compassion can reshape our relationship with possessions, desires, and ultimately ourselves. This isn't about escaping the world. It's about engaging with it more deeply, with a lighter heart and a clearer mind. It's about finding joy in what is essential and letting go of what weighs us down. So, as we begin this journey, consider this. The invitation to live simply is also an invitation to live fully. And in the midst of all the noise and distraction, perhaps the greatest luxury we can find is the quiet power of less. If we pause to look deeply at the human experience, one truth becomes clear. Much of our suffering is rooted in desire. We want more things, more achievements, more recognition, and often, this craving feels endless. But why is it that the more we chase, the more unsettled we become? Buddhism offers a profound insight into this dilemma. At the heart of its teachings lies the understanding that desire, or tanha in Pali, often translated as thirst or craving, is the root cause of suffering. This craving doesn't only refer to wanting things. It extends to clinging to ideas, relationships, identities, and even emotions. When we attach ourselves to these transient things, we set ourselves up for inevitable disappointment because nothing in this world is permanent. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths, which form the foundation of Buddhist philosophy, begin with a simple but powerful observation. Life involves suffering, dukkha. The second truth points directly to the cause, our insatiable desire and attachment. Understanding this is the first step towards liberation. In the context of minimalism, this teaching invites us to examine our relationship with possessions and consumption. Minimalism isn't simply about having fewer things. It's about recognizing how our attachment to things, to status, or to comfort fuels a cycle of dissatisfaction. Consider this. When you cling tightly to something, whether it's a physical object or a mental state, you create a tension, a resistance to change or loss. This tension breeds anxiety and fear. It's why losing a cherished possession can feel like losing a part of yourself, or why change can be so frightening. Buddhist wisdom encourages us to practice detachment, not as indifference or coldness, but as a mindful release from the compulsive grasping that limits our freedom. Detachment means appreciating things for what they are, without being enslaved by them. This principle aligns perfectly with the spirit of minimalist living. When we learn to let go of unnecessary attachments, we create space for clarity, peace, and true contentment. Minimalism becomes more than a decluttering of physical items. It transforms into a profound practice of freeing the mind. Imagine a life where you own your belongings, rather than being owned by them, where your happiness isn't dictated by the accumulation of things, but grows from an inner wellspring of peace. This is the essence of Buddhist minimalism. The journey to this freedom is not about sudden renunciation or harsh austerity. It is about gentle awareness, noticing when desire arises, understanding its impermanent nature, and choosing not to be ruled by it. It's a practice that unfolds moment by moment, inviting us to live with intention and wisdom. This deeper understanding of desire and detachment helps us see that minimalism is not about scarcity. It's about sufficiency. It's about honoring what truly nourishes our spirit and releasing what weighs us down. As we explore this path, the stories of Buddhist practitioners and monks who embody simplicity serve as living examples, not as distant ideals, but as inspirations for how we can bring this wisdom into our own lives, no matter how busy or complicated they may be. There is a quiet power in simplicity, a gentle strength that doesn't shout but whispers. It's the kind of peace that seeps into your bones, grounding you in the present moment. And this is where minimalism crosses the line from lifestyle choice to spiritual practice. In the Buddhist tradition, simplicity isn't merely about fewer possessions or a tidy home. It's a profound way of being. It is the practice of stripping away distractions to reveal the heart of life itself. By simplifying, we create room for the mind to settle, for the spirit to breathe freely. Imagine the mind like a lake. When cluttered with worries, desires, and noise, the surface becomes choppy and turbulent. But when simplicity takes hold, the surface calms, allowing the depths to become clear and still. This stillness is where true insight and peace arise. Many Buddhist monks and practitioners have embraced simplicity for centuries, not because it's trendy or convenient, but because it supports their path to awakening. Their sparse living quarters, humble robes, and mindful routines are reflections of a commitment to inner clarity, not outer accumulation. This approach invites us to rethink how we engage with the world. When we simplify our surroundings, we also simplify our minds. The fewer distractions we have, the more we can focus on what truly matters: compassion, presence, and understanding. Simplicity becomes a form of meditation in everyday life. Washing the dishes, walking to the market, or sitting quietly in a bare room can all become opportunities to practice mindfulness and gratitude. Each moment, free from clutter and chaos, opens a door to deeper connection with ourselves and others. Minimalism practiced this way is not a denial of life's richness. Rather, it reveals a richer quality of experience. It allows us to savor the ordinary with extraordinary presence. The taste of food, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of a breath, all become vibrant and full. Through this lens, peace isn't a distant goal but a present reality, accessible whenever we choose to clear away the excess. The act of letting go, whether it's physical possessions, mental chatter, or emotional baggage, becomes a sacred ritual that brings us home to ourselves. This journey towards simplicity also cultivates patience and humility. It teaches us to accept impermanence and to cherish the fleeting beauty in everything. In embracing less, we paradoxically gain more clarity, more freedom, and more love. The stories of those who have walked this path remind us that simplicity is not a sacrifice but a gift, a path leading inward, where the heart finds rest and the mind discovers its true nature. As we continue to explore how minimalism intertwines with Buddhist wisdom, we'll see how mindfulness sharpens this practice even further, guiding us to live consciously and consume wisely. In a world saturated with endless choices and constant marketing messages, it's easy to fall into automatic habits, buying without thinking, consuming without pause. But what if we could break this cycle? What if each purchase, each decision, was made with clear awareness and intention? This is the essence of mindfulness applied to consumption. Mindfulness means paying full attention to the present moment, observing without judgment. When applied to how we acquire and use things, it transforms our relationship with material goods from compulsive to conscious. Buddhism teaches us that mindfulness is the key to freedom. It shines a light on our patterns, revealing cravings and impulses that often operate beneath our awareness. By bringing these to the surface, we gain the power to choose rather than be driven by habit. Consider this. How often do we buy something simply because it's on sale or because everyone else has it? How often do we accumulate items out of fear? Fear of missing out, fear of inadequacy, or fear of scarcity? Mindful consumption challenges these fears, inviting us to ask deeper questions. Why do I want this? Does this object serve a true purpose? Will it bring lasting happiness or just a fleeting thrill? Is it aligned with my values and the life I want to live? When we answer honestly, we begin to see that many possessions add noise rather than harmony to our lives. They clutter not only our physical spaces but also our minds, distracting us from what truly nourishes our being. Conscious consumption also means honoring the impact of our choices on the environment, on communities, and on future generations. Buddhism's core ethic of compassion extends beyond ourselves, urging us to live in harmony with all beings. This awareness encourages simpler, more sustainable living. It invites us to buy less, choose well, and cherish what we have, to repair rather than replace, to give rather than hoard. Mindfulness turns every act of consumption into a moment of reflection and gratitude. It deepens our appreciation for the resources that sustain us and the interconnected web of life we are part of. Through this practice, minimalism becomes more than just owning less. It becomes a way of caring more. Caring for our own peace, for the planet, and for the well-being of others. The path of conscious consumption is a continuous journey. It requires patience and persistence, but each mindful choice creates ripples that extend far beyond ourselves. As we learn to consume with intention, we cultivate a life that is richer in meaning, gentler on the earth, and more aligned with the timeless wisdom of Buddhism. Minimalism, at its heart, is not a complicated philosophy, but a simple way to live with greater intention and clarity. Buddhist wisdom offers practical guidance on how to bring this ancient teaching into everyday life, transforming the way we relate to ourselves and the world around us. The first step is awareness. Begin by observing your habits without judgment. Notice where your attachments lie. Is it to possessions, habits, or even certain emotions? This mindful observation reveals patterns that keep us trapped in cycles of consumption and distraction. Next, practice letting go. This doesn't mean discarding everything at once or living in austerity. Instead, it's a gentle process of releasing what no longer serves your well-being. Start small. Maybe it's a drawer full of unused items or digital clutter on your phone. Each item released lightens your load and clears mental space. Third, cultivate gratitude. Buddhist teachings emphasize appreciating what we have, no matter how little. Gratitude shifts our focus from lack to abundance, from craving to contentment. When you recognize the value in the simple, everyday moments, minimalism becomes a joyous practice rather than a chore. Fourth, embrace mindful consumption as we've explored. Before acquiring anything new, ask yourself, do I truly need this? Will it support my well-being? Is it kind to others and the planet? These questions build a habit of conscious choice that ripples through all areas of life. Fifth, create sacred spaces, physical and mental, where simplicity reigns. A clean, uncluttered environment supports calm and clarity. Equally important is nurturing inner space through meditation, reflection, or simply breathing deeply. Sixth, adopt intentional routines. Simplify your daily rituals to include practices that nourish your mind and spirit, like mindful eating, walking meditation, or quiet moments of reflection. These routines anchor you in presence and reduce the chaos of overcommitment. Lastly, foster compassion for yourself and others. Minimalism is not about perfection or deprivation. It's about kindness, patience, and recognizing our shared human experience. By living simply, you create room to give and receive love more fully. These steps are not rules but invitations to explore your own path with curiosity and openness. Buddhist minimalism encourages us to meet life as it is, embracing both simplicity and depth. Remember, transformation unfolds gradually. Each mindful choice, each act of letting go, is a step toward a freer, more peaceful existence. The journey is the practice. As we continue, we will see how mindfulness deepens this transformation, helping us stay grounded amid life's inevitable ups and downs. Minimalism is not just a personal practice, it is a profound expression of compassion. When we choose to live with less, we open our hearts wider, not only to ourselves but to all beings who share this fragile planet. Buddhism teaches that everything is interconnected, a delicate web of cause and effect where every action ripples outward. Our choices about consumption and lifestyle carry weight far beyond our own lives. Minimalism, then, becomes an act of kindness toward others, a commitment to reduce harm and foster harmony. Think about the resources that go into making every object we own: water, energy, labor, land. When we consume less, we lessen our impact on the environment. We help preserve forests, rivers, and the air we breathe. This is not an abstract idea but a vital practice of right action, one of the pillars of the Buddhist Eightfold Path. Compassion also calls us to consider the people behind the products, the workers, farmers, and communities affected by our demands. Mindful minimalism means supporting fair trade, ethical production, and sustainability. It means valuing people's dignity as much as our own comfort. Living simply creates space to give. With fewer distractions and possessions, we have more time, energy, and resources to help others. Whether it's volunteering, donating, or simply listening with presence, minimalism opens doors to meaningful connection. This outward focus transforms minimalism from a solitary endeavor into a shared journey. It invites us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a greater whole, responsible for nurturing life in all its forms. In this way, minimalism becomes a radical act of love, a choice to live gently on the earth and generously toward all beings. It challenges the culture of excess and replaces it with a culture of care. The peace we cultivate through simplicity is inseparable from the peace we foster in the world. As we lighten our own burdens, we help lighten the burdens of others. This perspective deepens our practice, giving it purpose beyond personal well-being. It connects us to the timeless Buddhist ideal of metta, loving kindness, extending our compassion to the farthest reaches. As we move toward the close of this journey, we will reflect on how this path of minimalism, guided by Buddhist wisdom, leads us back to the essence of life: freedom, peace, and love. As we come to the close of this journey, it's clear that minimalist living, deeply rooted in Buddhist wisdom, offers far more than just decluttering our physical spaces. It's a profound transformation of the heart and mind, a path back to what truly matters. In simplicity, we find clarity. In letting go, we discover freedom. And in mindful living, we embrace a peace that cannot be shaken by the noise of the world. This ancient wisdom teaches us that true happiness is not found in possessions, but in presence, compassion, and the quality of our attention. Minimalism, guided by Buddhist insight, transforms the way we relate to ourselves, others, and the planet. It encourages us to live intentionally, consume consciously, and act compassionately. This way of life is a quiet revolution, one that frees us from the tyranny of excess and reconnects us to the sacred rhythms of life. Remember, the journey of minimalism is not about perfection or deprivation. It's about progress and gentle awakening. Each step you take, no matter how small, moves you closer to a life rich in meaning and peace. If this message resonates with you, I invite you to reflect on one simple question. What is one thing you can let go of today that will bring you closer to this freedom? Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Buddhist minimalism. If you found value in this journey, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps spread these timeless teachings and inspire others to live with greater peace and purpose. Together, let's walk this path of mindful simplicity, creating a world that honors what truly matters.